So I want to know what methodologies you use in your company to develop a product. Talk about some of the engineering best practices you use and what you compromise on and what you don't compromise on. And
Sure. All right, so let's. This is a large topic. There's probably a number of things that
sure,
we can talk about, and I'll probably start talking about things in no order of priority, right? So I'll talk
sure,
about things that
sure,
come to my
yeah.
mind first. I think first and foremost, I'll talk about agile methodologies, right? I mean,
Hmm.
like how do you break down your work, how you deliver, sprint planning, execution, how you run retrospectives, and all that is going to be a key part of, I suppose, like good engineering practices and so on.
Hmm.
Continuous integration and continuous delivery will play a big role. Um, you know, um, we whenever we talk about CI and CD, I mean, like, you want to kind of like build as much as you can in the build pipeline itself. So, we talk about things like um, unit testing and all those kind of things. So, it's very common to see a lot of companies have like, unit tests run as part of the builds and everything else. But you got to kind of like move away from just that. You look at mature teams, they not only do these things, they not only do like peer reviews of code, but they also kind of like include a whole bunch of these things into the build pipeline itself. Things such as checking for secure coding practices or whether we meet certain guidelines. Um, we've used products like Sonar Cube that's actually built into the pipeline in the past.
Hmm.
White Source is another product that I've kind of like played around with. It kind
Hmm.
of like checks for things like open source vulnerabilities, right?
True.
So you think about some of those things like, look, how do you do this? A lot of these things are done manually. So, by actually putting a lot of these things into the build pipeline, it just makes, we talk about good engineering practices. Those are the kind of things that we should be aspiring towards rather than having checking these things manually. It's all automatic, right?
True. True.
um, Feature flagging and A/B testing.
Hmm.
Feature flagging really allows you to release to production, frequently. So even if something is not complete, you can keep releasing it. As soon as you commit, you can actually start releasing it to production, and those features need not be visible for people to use.
True.
So
So do
a
you do
big
your
believer of
testing
that.
also in production a little bit?
Sorry.
Do you do your testing of a feature in production?
I think in the past we have, right?
Okay.
I mean, like,
Mhm.
in like you said, I've been in this industry for about 28 years. And I
Mhm.
think every company has a different journey towards maturity of these practices itself, right?
Right. Right.
In some projects, and I won't say companies, because even within a company, from project to project, the maturity actually differs.
Different.
And the short answer to your question is like, do we do some of the stuff in production? The short answer is yes, right? So some of
Mhm.
them have been, there's a lot of testing that actually happens in production. You shut it down and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Um, even if it doesn't work well, there's the whole point of A/B testing. You try something out and it doesn't work well. Customers don't take it well. You kind of like start to those features eventually disappear as well, right?
Right.
Um, I'm also, in terms of engineering practice, I'm a big believer in architecting your application for resilience and high availability. I've done
Mm.
a lot of talks on this thing. I'm quite passionate about it, and I think um, this some of the stuff needs to be built from the ground up. And I
True.
believe that it is an engineering practice, and it's not something that you kind of like add towards the end, fixing it through deployment. We'll just deploy it into multiple servers and it'll take care of high availability and things like. It just doesn't work that way. So,
Absolutely.
architecting applications with the belief that something is going to fail, right,
Mhm.
is really important. So, anything can happen, right? You can have like network issues, hardware failure, transient errors, humans introducing errors into the system, downstream services failing. So how do you actually cater for all of that stuff? Needs to be built into the application itself.
Right.
So architecting for that is really essential.
How much
Um,
how much documentation you put emphasis on while developing this product? Like, do you
so
have a BRD functional spec, tech spec? Do you write it or not?
yeah. Um, So I'm not a big believer of big design upfront, where you kind of like go ahead and do a lot of these designs and you document everything else. A lot of projects in recent times we used Confluence to document, so wiki style of documentation.
Mm,
So we do have solution architecture and things like that documented there. There's a standard template that people follow. The standard template makes it easier for people to just document the most important things that is important, that is necessary
true.
for the project, rather than actually start to waffle around everything about the project and so on. You have a standard template and say like, these are the things. This is how your focus is on diagrams to actually explain everything else. So to answer your question, right, I'm a big believer in just documenting what's enough,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Putting it into an online, like a wiki or something like, like a Confluence or whatever that is, right?
Right.
It is, people kind of like, yeah, I don't really, I'm not a big fan of the term, and kind of like they talk about this as a living document kind of thing, right?
Mm,
As the document is never it's not final, and changes are being made to it all the time and so on.
true.
I'm kind of like big believer in it. So you kind of like start making changes, and because there are these documents are versioned as well, you kind of like know what the state of the application is at a certain snapshot in time and everything else, and how it's evolving over time. And when new people start on the project, can they get a really good understanding by reading some of this documentation, things like that.
Hmm.
That's what I like. So there are two types, right? So I would like to have a document that actually talks about some of the practices that we
Mm,
follow in the team and the architecture of the application or product
application.
itself, right?
Yeah.
The code itself has to be self-documenting. So there's no point in actually putting lots and lots of comments within your code and saying, oh, look, this piece of this does that, this piece of this does that, and so on. And so that's if you need to have a lot of documentation in your code to explain what that piece of code does, then you need
Yeah.
to kind of like reassess and redo that piece, in my
True,
mind.
true. No, what I seen is once upon a time, I think 10, 15 years back, we used to have functional specs like 200, 300 pages spec, which is
And then
written in a
nobody read
couple
them.
of months and all that. And now from there, I want, basically in my company, I want a 2, 3 pages of spec, which tells me enough that what we are building, at least
Yeah,
hand-drawn screen, something that what we are heading towards.
yeah,
And but sometimes people think on the name of agile, just start coding and don't get into any kind of documentation. And I think that's wrong too. You should
yeah,
have something bare minimum, which is
yeah,
important for a team to communicate among
yeah.
themselves.
I think just enough documentation is the right thing, and
Right.
and people can question like, what is just enough, right? and
Yes.
and again, it varies from team to team. So if people, you should have, and that's why things like user stories and things like that caught on, because the whole
Yes.
point of like, look, we just write enough to say, well, this is what the functionality is. You kind of like describe it. Some of it, for clarification, you kind of like ask people more about it, and then you kind of like
Right.
get clarification on it. What your acceptance criteria is and everything else. So for the testers and so on, they know what they're doing. Um, and that's the capturing the requirements, right? And then the next stage is like, okay, well, now that we capture the requirements, what does the system do? And how do all the different components fit in together, and everything else forms the other part of it. And things like API and so on. I mean, these days you have tools that will actually generate a lot of
True. A
uh,
lot of documentation for you.
documentation for you,
Yeah.
and that tells you what that API does and so on. So I think that's all that is covered.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think again, touching on the engineering practices and so on, right? I mean, you kind of like need to automate as much as possible. I think that is the core of everything, in my opinion.
Mm,
If you go back and see how we've kind of like evolved as an industry as well, in the beginning, right? Like I remember the times where I would compile code in my own PC and hand it over to the people who are deploying it. I mean,
right.
so in those days, like when I started, like I was the one who was actually deploying it as well. So
True.
and that changed when it was, like in terms of maturity, there are teams who are actually deploying it, write a script and say, do this, back up the database, do this, do that, and so on. And you give it to them and they do it, right? And we've
Yeah.
evolved. And then, we kind of like gave scripts to them for them to run. So they would just
Yeah.
go and run the script and deploy it. And we've changed everything. Now we don't even have people deploying it. You kind of like have this, CI/CD pipeline actually doing all these things. And I
Right.
spoke about things like even security coding practices and all that checked by the build pipeline. So we are
Yeah.
we are automating more and more. We have automation testing coming in. We've done that, but then we kind of like hit a snag, I suppose. Like once it's put into production, what if something actually goes wrong? And so we started putting things like logs and alerts into the thing and said, look, when something's gone wrong, you get an alert and I'm going to fix it. And then the second question, like, why do we still need someone to go and fix it? Like, why can't we actually even automate that when we have things like self-healing and think this is where like in auto scaling, if some of those resources are running low, can you auto scale?
Right.
All those kinds of things are all part of the automation thing. So looking for all these opportunities to automate is, I think, part of the core. Talk about engineering practice. I think that constant improvement, right, continuous improvement is part of
Exactly.
the whole thing. I think.
True, agree. Yeah. In fact,
And I think
you reminded me of those painful days in Microsoft. I was in Microsoft.com, and there
yeah,
used to be a release team, and there will be a release meeting before we release, and everybody will plan to be in office for a whole night,
yeah,
and we will
pizzas.
have multiple pages that you will
Yeah,
take the server out, then this database will go offline, then you change. Oh my God.
yeah,
And then this code is deployed to thousands of servers and still manual, all those things going on.
yeah,
Very, very painful time.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm thankful to, to this new technology that
Yeah.
we have got rid of all those manual
Yeah,
steps.
and we used to order pizzas. We'd have outages planned and everything
Oh
else,
my
and
God. Yeah,
like you have like a senior management sitting in the offices waiting for
yeah,
they're like, is something going wrong? Something happened. What happens when you roll back everything else? Now it's all seamless. You kind of like try and make sure that you deploy with zero downtime, right? So you talk about
exactly.
zero downtime deployments. You do a deployment and actually nobody knows that it's actually done, right? That's the level of
Exactly.
maturity that you want to get to.
True, true.
I mean, unfortunately, a lot of companies, we still can't get to that level of maturity, right? I mean, there's
Yes.
still a lot going on in terms of like you still need to have an outage, and I think that's an when you talk about a journey of maturity, I think that's what people need to aspire to.
Yeah.
It's like somebody's making a deployment, nobody actually knew that it happened, everything was
That's the
fine.
success. Yes.
That's it, right? So when nobody talks about it, then it's a good thing. So,
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. True. True. So,
but I
Mesh,
think
yeah,
I'll
go
just
ahead.
mention one thing, right? I mean, like
Sure.
you speak about a lot of these things around um, engineering practice and things like that. There are probably two or three things that underpins all of these things, and I think one of the key things is around like a DevOps or DevSecOps, the culture of that, right? I think that's
Mm,
one of those things where people who write code are responsible for for it in production, and if something goes wrong, they can. They can get paged at night is what they actually say. The standard example is like, oh, you write some code and you kind of like in the past you handed it over to someone else to look after it. But
right.
what if you get a page get a call at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? So you kind of like need to make sure that nothing goes wrong, and you're responsible for it.
Yeah.
I think there's the second. I think culture is like the culture of innovation within the team, just the ability to
Right.
innovate and do new things. People run things like innovation sprints and so on in organizations to say, look, in this sprint, all we're going to do is like innovation, or they have
Mm,
hack days and things like that to come up with ideas and everything else. And the third thing, I suppose, like in my teams, one of the things that I try and promote is around embracing things like design thinking and human-centered design and all those kind of things, right?
mm,
So kind of like
mm,
make sure
mm.
that it's incorporated in every aspect of work that you do. I think these kind of like you have all these engineering practices, but I think these things, I'm not sure whether you call them thinking or cultural, whatever it is, kind of like underpins
Yes.
all of those things as well. Yeah.
Yes. Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. All of them, I think, are very, very important for a successful of an engineering team. Yeah. So next question I have, Mahesh, is